Senator Canavan.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Acting Deputy President. And I was listening to Senator Wright, and I find it a remarkable contribution to say that somehow the issues surrounding the Australian Wheat Board and that the Oil for Food scandal weren't properly investigated. There was numerous inquiries. There was a Royal Commission into that particular scandal, and that Royal Commission did actually recommend 12 people should be subject to criminal proceedings. Now, those criminal charges did not actually end up being made, but I'm not exactly sure what Senator Wright is suggesting. It seems to me she's suggesting that somehow we should be double guessing and questioning the judgment of the various directors of public prosecutions in our state and federal jurisdictions, because they are the ones who decide whether to proceed with criminal judgments. And I don't believe it should be up to us as politicians or members of the executive government, and I don't believe Senator Wright actually would agree with this position, for us to direct DPPs to take very particular criminal charges. It's a ridiculous suggestion from Senator Wright that somehow the executive government should be held accountable for the DPP not proceeding with criminal charges. I don't know the specifics of the case, but I do actually have some trust and confidence in the various law enforcement agencies in our country and their record of integrity and independence, and it is up under our system their judgment on whether criminal proceedings should proceed. Obviously, in this instance, they did not decide that. Now, the lack of detailed argument from Senator Wright for the establishment of such a serious body here in Australia, the lack of any actual examples of corrupt behaviour, none in her speech. I listened to most of it. It was all about innuendo, potential people doing this and that in dark rooms, but no actual example of corruption. No actual example of corruption. And they want to establish a whole new body in our Commonwealth Parliament jurisdiction, despite the fact there's already bodies that look at this. Indicates to me this is just another stunt from the Greens. It's another stunt from the Greens to put on this piece of legislation. They know it's not going to get passed, but it's another stunt for them to gain some kind of media attention. They are becoming the masters of stunts in this particular chamber. They are the Captain Risky of this particular chamber. Those ads at the moment that are running, they're quite humorous. I can't actually remember the insurance company they're promoting, and I probably shouldn't say it in the chamber to promote them, but they are the Captain Risky of Australian politics right now. They are just doing stunts all the time for no particular purpose, for no actual gain for our country or the people that live here. It is simply about getting exposure for themselves and their own political purposes. And that's not how I think this chamber should be run, and I don't think that's how we should bring things into this chamber. I also want to make the point on this particular bill that the Greens are bringing forward that I don't think they're having a conscience vote on this bill. I don't think they're giving their members a conscience vote on this bill. It's another bill that the Greens don't have a conscience vote. They want to say that all other political parties should have conscience votes on things, but they don't apply their own principles to themselves. Now, the other day, Senator Di Natale came into this place and argued that we should ban sniffer dogs. We should get rid of sniffer dogs. They're apparently a great threat to the personal liberty of people here in this country, sniffer dogs, according to the Greens. Now, I don't think they're having a conscience vote on that position either. I don't think they have a conscience vote on sniffer dogs, the Greens. And I reckon there might be some Green senators who actually support sniffer dogs. I think there might be some more reasonable Greens. Senator Ludlam might support sniffer dogs. I think Senator Whish-Wilson's quite reasonable. He'd probably support sniffer dogs. But they don't have a conscience vote on that position either. It's all Stalinist, democratic socialism for the Greens, all day, every day.
Senator Ludlam.
A point of order, Mr Acting Deputy President, just on relevance. I'd ask you to draw Senator Canavan's remarks to the question that's before the chair, and if you would maybe put to him why he seems keen to talk about anything at all except the bill that's in front of us on corruption and parliamentary entitlements.
Thank you, Senator. There is no point of order. That's a debating point.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I actually think sniffer dogs are a very important part of our anti-corruption framework in this country. I will expand later in this speech about how we have a multi-tiered, multi-pronged approach to anti-corruption, and sniffer dogs are some of the most important law enforcement officers we have in this country. And I strongly want to put on the record my defence for sniffer dogs, despite the Greens wanting to abolish their positions and lose sniffer dogs' jobs all around the country. Now, the other point I want to make here, Mr Acting Deputy President, is that the Greens come into this place And they want to, as I said earlier, make all these innuendos and suggestions about other people and other political parties, yet they don't hold a mirror to their own actions on these matters. And it has been mentioned in this debate previously, but it's worth repeating that and I think the Australian people would be interested to know that the largest donation in Australian political history went to the Greens political party. Mr Graham Wood gave a very large donation to the Greens political party a few years ago. Now, I don't want to make any suggestion that influenced the Greens, but given they have raised innuendos about our political party, I think it's important to put on the record here in this chamber that at the same time, or a very similar time, that donation was made to the Greens political party, they were in this chamber moving motions with the authority of their leader at the time, former Senator Bob Brown, in support of policies which benefited Mr Graham Wood. Now, I have no evidence that there was any form of corrupt behaviour, but at least I'm up front with that. At least I'm up front with that. They come in here and want to make allegations and slurs against other senators and other political parties without any evidence, and then say, "Oh, all these old political parties are terrible and corrupt." Well, that is a hypocritical approach from their perspective, because it's the kind of behaviour they engage in themselves, but of course don't want to say at the same time they raise innuendos about others. Because this whole argument, this whole debate on this bill is all based on innuendo. It's based on no evidence whatsoever. There has been no evidence provided to the chamber, and this bill is being presented here after a long MPI debate we had, I think, late last year. And in that MPI debate, there was no evidence either presented that there is any kind of corruption occurring on a large scale or a systematic way at the federal government level. Indeed, the actual evidence that does exist shows that we have a very enviable record on corruption in Australia. Transparency International has done an international comparison on corruption in different countries, and Australia ranks 9 out of 177 countries on that scale. A proud record. We should be proud of that. Now, that doesn't mean that we are perfect and we can't do more to ensure that corruption does not occur, but we are by no means a country that is behind the race on this measure. Another report that confirms this standard or this statistic is a World Economic Forum Global Competitiveness Index report done recently, which they survey businesses across the world in different countries and ask them what are the biggest issues facing them in those particular countries and what are the barriers for them doing business. And it does cover a range of issues, this report, not just corruption. But it's worth noting that in Australia, Australian businesses rate corruption as the equal last issue for them in facing their business and doing business in Australia. And of course that's not the case in some other countries, unfortunately. But in our country, it is not a major issue facing business. And again, that's something we should be proud of. Now, we're ranked 9 out of 177. There are other countries that are slightly ahead of us. We're in a group of countries that are lucky enough not to have the scourge of corruption that infiltrate their wider society. And other countries, like us, also don't have anti-corruption bodies that, like the Greens, want to establish. So similar countries to us, like the United States and Canada, themselves have not established anti-corruption bodies, and they too rank very highly on these corruption indices. So there's simply no correlation between having a lack of corruption in a country, an economy and a business sector free of corrupt activities, and having a federal anti-corruption body. One does not necessarily lead to the other, and again, it's another indication that there's been no evidence provided here. And I actually think before we establish new bureaucracies or new government agencies to deal with the matter, it should be incumbent on any of us, whether they be a political party or individual senators, proposing such a bureaucracy to bring forward the evidence of why they want to establish that body. And that body has not, that evidence, has not been established at all. There is simply nothing here that's being brought by the Greens political party that shows there is corrupt activities at the federal government level, and therefore I don't know if this bill has been costed at all. It probably hasn't, given the Greens. I think Ken Henry said once rightly that there's not a supercomputer big enough to be able to cost the Greens' policies. He's probably right. So we should all make sure we produce evidence before we want to spend more public money and divert more attention in the Commonwealth government bureaucracy, and the Greens completely fail to do that time and time again. Now, it's also the case that when the Greens bring this case forward, they don't actually— Chair, I think you— sorry, the Chair's a little—
I've got a lot going on at one time. Was there a point of order?
There's a point of order, Mr Acting Deputy President. Senator Canavan, maybe unwittingly but at least uncaringly, has misled the chamber. The proposal was costed by the Parliamentary Budget Office at $90 million, and I ask you to draw that to the attention of the hapless senator.
It's a debating point, and so I'll give the call back to Senator Canavan.
Thank you, Mr Acting President. I do thank, through you, Chair Senator Ludlam, for bringing that to my attention. I did say I wasn't sure if it was costed, so I don't believe I've misled the Senate at all, but I do actually appreciate you bringing that figure to me, because $90 million, $90 million. I mean, as I've said earlier, they haven't produced any evidence of corruption, but they want to spend $90 million on a problem that doesn't exist. It just shows and confirms the approach of the Greens towards broader economic issues, towards a public debate. They have no concern for the spending of public money, and they are quite happy to make a proposal costing millions of dollars for Australian taxpayers. That is, they have brought no evidence in to suggest that it's an issue that they know has no chance of actually passing here today, because they don't actually try and argue for it. They don't go around to us all and say, hey, do you want to vote for this? It might be a good idea. They don't do that. They don't do any of that. They don't actually work with other political parties and senators to try and convince them. All they do is come into this chamber and put forward stunts, because it's not for this chamber. It's not for getting actual legislation through and effective policies implemented. For them, it's all for the exposure and political purposes. And it's all about the stunt. It's all about the stunt with the Greens. Because, again, as I was going to say before I was interrupted, not only did the Greens present no evidence for this body to be implemented, they then go on and ignore the fact that we actually have a variety of agencies in place in Australia to deal with anti-corruption. Indeed, we have one primary body whose task is to put a check on corruption in Australia. The Australian Commission for Law Enforcement Integrity itself is charged specifically with investigating corrupt allegations, and it's been in existence for some years. Indeed, last year, its investigations led to the arrest of an Australian federal police officer for allegations of corruption. And while, as I said earlier, we do rank highly on corruption relative to other countries, there's no doubt that sometimes, unfortunately, it does occur, and we should, of course, have appropriate law enforcement agencies looking at these issues and enforcing the law when the law is breached. And it's not only the Australian Law Enforcement Integrity Commission is the primary body, but other bodies also assist in this task, including the Australian Crime Commission and the Australian Border Protection Force and the Australian Federal Police themselves. Indeed, this government has sought to strengthen the resources available in this field and to these bodies. The Australian government has made $1 million extra available to the Australian Commission for Law Enforcement Integrity to help its own activities. And I think, personally, that's a lot more responsible approach to this issue than picking up $90 million from the air. I'm not exactly sure what this $90 million will be used for. It would be a massive bureaucracy, no doubt, but there is no clear issue with the way corruption is handled at a federal level, and it's good that the government, though, is continuing to make sure it's well-resourced, because it's a very important area. The government has also announced Task Force Farris, which is particularly looking at issues of corruption in the Australian Customs and Border Protection Service. There have been a number of issues there raised in the last few years, and again it's right and proper that something specific has been established here to investigate. Now, I want to, with the time available to me, move to the broader issues of establishing a anti-corruption body, like the means of which the Greens want to establish. It's not just that this would create a bureaucracy and cost money. It is that the kind of body the Greens want to establish will and does, at state government levels, restrict individual liberties. Now, I do believe at times it is appropriate for liberties to be restricted where there is an appropriate public policy concern. But I do note that generally the Greens are not on that side. Generally, when issues restricting individual liberties come forward in this chamber, and they have a number of times in the past year, the Greens oppose those changes. So we have passed legislation in the past year that has restricted liberties to help try and protect our country against terrorist activities, and I believe they have been appropriate changes to the law. And I note the Labor Party's support for those changes. They are serious issues, and we should seriously consider any time we seek to restrict individual liberty. But generally speaking, and certainly particularly speaking on these issues in the past year, the Greens have opposed those changes because they see it as a breach of human rights to restrict individual liberty, and that is well within their right to hold those positions. But I note here that they don't then outline why and make a case for why liberties should be restricted here in this instance. There is no case being made in human rights law or in philosophy as well about why would it be right and proper to restrict liberties in this case, because these bodies have very specific powers at the state level, the ICAC and in my state the Crime and Corruption Commission, have the power to force people to give evidence. And that traditionally has been something that has been protected in common law and in other similar countries in constitutions. Now, we don't have what is colloquially known as taking the fifth in this country, but in the United States they have a constitution in their Bill of Rights, protection against being forced to give evidence, particularly where it would incriminate yourself. But we do have a tradition in English common law that this is not permissible, that the powers that are given to bodies like ICAC and the CCC are akin to Star Chambers. Now, Star Chambers, the word comes as a colloquial term from the Middle Ages, where the kings of England would establish chambers to try to force people to reveal whether they'd committed the great sin of being a Catholic or not. That's what these chambers were originally established for, that they would force witnesses to divulge whether they were Papists and believed in the Pope and Rome and not the Church of England. And over time, they were established at the time, but over time English common law ruled that it was not right and proper to force individuals to provide evidence, because you're put in a corner when you're forced to provide evidence to a court of law or to some chamber or to, in this case, a corruption body. You either have to speak the truth, and if you do incriminate yourself, you obviously face the sanction of that particular court of law, or you don't give evidence, and if you don't give evidence, you are subject to perjury under these bodies. And I don't think it's right and proper to force individuals in that case in all circumstances. Sometimes, I said earlier, sometimes it may be right and proper to restrict liberties. And at the state government level, they have decided to establish these bodies. They do restrict individual liberties. They do help to get to the root of corruption at certain times, but it is something that needs to be balanced by any responsible government before it's introduced. It's something that needs to be considered at least, and the Greens have not even considered these issues in their promotion of this bill, and that is a great failing, in my view, of this particular proposal. We need to seriously consider whether it's right and proper at the federal government level to establish a commission that does restrict individual liberty against the potential benefits of rooting out corruption. Now, there have not been the evidence provided that corruption is a major issue, and therefore I do not think it's right and proper to go against the hundreds of years of tradition in our legal system that protects individuals against giving evidence that might incriminate themselves. And on this point, I'd like to conclude with some issues in my state. The Crime and Corruption Commission in my state was established after the Fitzgerald inquiry, which exposed serious corruption in Queensland. But what is not commonly known is that the Fitzgerald inquiry did not recommend the establishment of a crime and misconduct, was then called the Crime and Misconduct Commission, and it did not recommend that for this precise reason, that it would be restrictive of individual liberties and, in their view, was not a necessary response to the issues that the Fitzgerald inquiry uncovered. Now, obviously, well, it was then a coalition government, a Liberal and National government in Queensland, did not agree with that recommendation and established a Crime and Misconduct Commission. That was something that the Queensland Parliament debated and considered, and given the serious corruption exposed, thought was an appropriate response to those activities. And I make the point that before we'd implement something similar here in the federal sphere, we'd want to have that evidence, that exposure of some serious and systematic corruption that simply has not happened, and the Greens have simply not brought forward, and therefore this bill should be opposed by this chamber.